You're listening to Margins and Meaning with John Wilson. This show accepts zero responsibility for bruised egos, uncomfortable reflections, or that sudden realization that the weekend course you just promoted might need a little more runway before you hit the conference circuit. Anything I say here is just my opinion. It's not CE. It's not legal advice. It's not a lecture. It's a perspective earned slowly. And if you choose to listen, do so at your own risk, preferably with humility, because I'm telling you guys, this one is going to ask something out of you. Thank you. We're living in a time where speed can look a lot like depth, and visibility can look a lot like wisdom. And you see, in a trade like ours, that confusion has a cost. You can learn a workflow in a weekend. You earn authority through repetition. You know, I want to tell you about a phone call I didn't get too long ago. It was a friend of mine, a client, someone I really respected. He was doing some great work in this trade, and he calls me up, and he's super excited. He just got back from a course. It was one of those 2 days, full arch, all on X, digital workflow, soup to nuts type of courses, and he was pumped. And honestly, I was happy for him. That enthusiasm is something that I think this trade really needs. But then he said something that stopped me cold. He said, "John, I think I'm ready to start teaching this." 2 days. And now he's ready to teach. I didn't say what I was thinking in that moment. I said something kind and redirected the conversation. But when I hung up that phone, I sat there with a feeling for a while. Because it wasn't anger, it wasn't arrogance on his part. I think it was something more complicated than that. I think it's maybe a symptom of something that's been quietly building in our trade for the better part of a decade. And I think it's time that we actually talk about it, honestly. And here's the thing. I'm not against new technology. You know that if you've listened to any of the first 11 episodes of this show. Digital made me relevant. I've said that 100 times. The tools we have today are just plain extraordinary. Cases that took weeks now take days. The accuracy that used to require these heroic efforts are now almost built into the workflow. That's not nothing. That's truly remarkable. But something else has happened alongside all of that progress. You see, the path to producing something that looks correct has gotten shorter. And when the path gets shorter, it becomes easier. Not just possible, but genuinely easy. Easy to confuse producing with understanding. Easier to confuse completing the case with actually mastering it. To confuse being able to do something with being ready to teach it. I spent the first years of my career in a garage lab that I affectionately have called the furnace. And it's aptly named. There was no AC in there. You know, I had a box fan that did nothing but move the hot air around from one part of the room to the other. That Bunsen burner running off that barbecue propane tank, and those amazing plywood benches I built myself. I still laugh at that model trimmer I got from surplus that had been sitting so long it almost calcified and something close to a sculpture. And I was learning denture work. Not digital at that time, not CAD, wax and acrylic and plaster. And my hands. Every day. And here's what that process did for me that no weekend course could ever replicate. It made me fail in 100 small ways before anything could really go wrong. It exposed those weak points of the system through repetition. Not once, not twice, but over and over until my hands understood what my brain was still catching up to. I want to be straight with you about something. There was a long stretch of my career, longer than I'd really like to admit, where maybe I was running on confidence that I fully hadn't earned yet. You know, the doctors would call, cases would come in, these very complex situations attached to them. And I'd pick up the phone, I'd look at a case on the bench somewhere. In the back of my mind, there was a voice just saying, "God, I hope I'm right about this." I was never certain. I was mostly hoping. And guys, you know that feeling. If you've been in this trade long enough, you know exactly what I'm describing. Because when you're young and in the lab, there's an enormous pressure to appear like you have it all figured out. Now, these dentists are trusting you with something very important. Patients you'll never meet are depending on the work that you're producing. And the natural instinct is to project certainty, even when you're still just assembling that puzzle. So you do. You project. You answer the question. You try to sound like the person they need you to be. And that's not dishonest. Not exactly. It's survival. It's part of how you grow, because sometimes committing to the answer, even if it's slightly imperfect, is really what teaches you whether you were right or not. But something shifts over time, and it doesn't shift overnight. It shifts case by case, problems by problems, failure by failure. You start accumulating what I call reps. Not just the successful ones, the ones that went sideways, the cases that came back, the phone calls where the doctor was just so mad. And you had to stand there and figure out whether the problem was you or them. Whether you had the knowledge to tell the difference is really what it's all about. Each of these moments adds a layer, and eventually, after enough of those layers, something different starts to happen. Something different happens in your conversations. You're no longer figuring it out with the answers while you're talking. You already know them before the question is actually finished. That shift is one of the most important transitions in a technician's career. It's the moment where experience starts to become authority. Not that loudest voice in the room, not the biggest ego, just the thing I just described in episode 11. Someone calls you before they cut a tooth, not because you need to tell them what to do. They ask you what you think. That's different. That's trust. And trust built into something that you cannot shortcut. For me, the goal has always been the same. Become that expert in my own environment. Not to dominate anyone, but so that my clients would stop sending me cases like an order form and bring me into the conversation so that I was able to shape the outcomes before a single tool ever touched the bench. Over time, that's exactly what happened to me. And when it did, my role really changed. I wasn't just fabricating the prosthetics anymore. I was guiding decisions, asking questions that hadn't been asked, anticipating the problems before they arrived. And that's where the real value of experience lives. Not in the hands. The hands are just the instrument. The value lives in the judgment behind them. And that judgment, I can tell you this clearly and with certainty, that doesn't come from just the course. It comes from the reps you just couldn't skip. These shows, I start with a story. I want to tell you about it. Now, this is from earlier in my career, and it's funny because this particular case, it wasn't the most complex case. That wasn't because the outcome just failed, but it was because maybe a lesson burned into me. And it burned into me in a way that I fully didn't really understand until much after that case was way gone out of the lab. I'll share it was in the early days of implant dentistry, long before digital workflows, long before CAD designs, long before we had a guided system that took us from left to right. Back then, everything was manual, and these big cases were daunting. We were waxing it up full contour, casting to these non-oxidizing gold UCLA abutments. And guys, those components were not cheap. Throwing 3 ounces of high noble gold at anything is a scary task. And every single time that sucker went in the furnace, you felt it. You're not experimenting. You weren't guessing. There was no margin for error. And this case stays with me. It was a roundhouse. I think it was all on 6-ish and total PFM buildup, and it's tough. If you worked on those cases, you know how daunting they are. But like most of these cases, it did. I went all in on it. I pushed hard. I leaned on what I knew at the time. I spent hours waxing this sucker up to full contour. Every contour was just perfectly deliberate, every connection considered. I wasn't rushing anything. I wasn't cutting any corners. I was doing exactly what I knew how to do. And then it gets casted, and the fitting and the sectioning and the soldering, all to achieve this passivity that is just so difficult in these types of cases. It was methodical, small, tiny adjustments, careful verification, learning every single time that I touched it. You can't force these frameworks into place. Passivity has to be earned. These implants, they don't care about what you're feeling. So I earned it. And then we moved to porcelain. And God knows when you degas anything and lay that opaque down and you start to do your first build-up and it's taking shape and you're getting excited and everything's looking great. And then you glaze it. And that's when it always happens. That damn bubble that propagates through. Nothing that can ruin your day more than having no time to spare and having to strip it back down to the frame. You know, I still remember that feeling. It's just gut-wrenching. It just kicks you so hard. But guys, I didn't panic. I didn't have anger at anybody. You know, it was just that personal frustration that comes with doing every single damn step correct, or at least what you believe is correct, and still falling short. That's a different feeling than the frustrating part of maybe cutting a corner and paying for it later. The kind that you understand, you know, that's the easy way. You know, you can see that coming. This was something else. This was a true system teaching me that maybe my understanding had a ceiling to it, and I hadn't figured it all out yet. But I eventually fixed the case and it delivered, but guys, I didn't let it go. This was the part that I really want you to hear. You see, long after that case left the lab, I kept turning it over in my mind. Where was the contamination from? How did I not catch it? What did I do wrong? Was there something in the first firing cycle that I screwed up on? Was it the material? Where was the impurity? What didn't I fully understand yet? Those questions didn't have immediate answers, but over time, through more reps, more attention, more asking, they started to resolve into some sort of knowledge, into a deeper understanding of how the system actually behaves versus how I thought it would behave. And then the next time I approached a case like that, I wasn't guessing in the same way. I'd seen the weak point. I felt where that system had limits. I built that into how I worked. That's what experience is. Experience at its core. It's not just the number of years you've been doing something, it's the number of problems you refuse to ignore. Moment when something doesn't go the way it's supposed to. You know, the case looked perfect on the bench, but somehow behaves just a bit differently after firing. The framework that seemed passive reveals tension at delivery. Somehow that material reacts in a way that wasn't really on your radar. And in that moment, you have two paths. You can chalk it up and move on and get to the next case coming in the door, or you can slow down and ask the questions that matter. Like, why did this happen? Now, I know this trade and the pace that we're going today doesn't make that especially easy. You know, the cases move fast. The turnarounds and the expectations have compressed over these years to the point where slowing down generally to analyze anything can feel like a luxury you can't afford. And here's what I've learned, and it's took me longer than it should have. You know, the time you spend understanding why something failed is almost always cheaper than the time you spend dealing with the same failure again and again and again. Because when you skip the reflection, you don't actually move past the problems, you just go around them. And going around it means it stays in the system, patiently waiting to rear its ugly head again. There's a kind of technician who becomes the person everyone calls when something goes sideways. You probably know that type. Maybe you've been lucky enough to work alongside one. When there's a complication in the lab, they're not the ones to panic. They're the ones that pull up the stool and look at the case calmly. And they start asking the questions that cut right to the center of the problem. You know, those guys, those people didn't get there just because they were naturally gifted. I think they got there because over their long career, they refused to ignore those moments that most people fast forward past. They cultivated a habit that sounds simple and is actually hard. And when something surprises them, well, they get curious instead of defensive. I've always tried hard to work that way, not because I'm noble about it, because I'm just stubborn. Something happens that I fully don't understand. Well, it bothers me until I do. I find myself thinking about these cases in the car, in the middle of dinner, laying in bed. Not with anxiety, but with curiosity, turning it over, trying to see the angle I missed. That habit, more than almost anything else in my career, is what's built my judgment. And judgment is the thing you actually need when the cases stop following the script. Not the workflow, not the software, not the technique you saw demonstrated last weekend. Judgment. Repetition is the mechanism. Reflection is the engine. You need both. One without the other doesn't get you there, guys. In fact, repetition without reflection can do something counterproductive. It can actually make you very efficient at doing the things wrong. You can repeat flawed processes 500 times and get very good at producing the same flawed outcome with greater speed and confidence. That's not mastery. That's just practice mediocrity. True improvement comes from pairing the repetition with an honest eye, an eye that doesn't flinch when it sees something it doesn't want to see. You know, I want to be careful here because this is the part of the conversation that can go sideways fast if it isn't framed correctly. I'm not anti-digital. I've never been anti-digital. Digital dentistry is remarkable. The things it's made possible in my lab, in this trade, in patient outcomes, well, they're real and they're significant. I've built my entire relevance in the modern era on the back of digital tools. So when I say what I'm about to say, I want you to hold that context. When I came up in this trade, learning was grinding and slow, sometimes maddening process. You learn waxing, you learn casting, you learn ceramics and finishing. You learn how one step affected the next and the next and the next one after that. There were no shortcuts. If something didn't fit, well, you had to understand why. If the porcelain fractured, well, you had to understand why. If the framework distorted in the furnace, well, you had to understand why. The system itself demanded understanding, because there was no layer between you and the problem. Today, many of the tools in this trade are designed intentionally and brilliantly to simplify that journey. The design software, automated occlusion tools, these digital libraries provide pre-built anatomy. The guided workflows move the technicians through each stage of the process with visual prompts and guardrails. Those tools are extraordinary. They've opened the door to the trade to people who might never have gotten under that old model. They've increased precision. They've reduced certain types of error. They've generally moved the profession forward. But they've also changed something that doesn't get talked about enough. They change how people learn. And specifically, they've made it possible to produce something that looks correct before you fully understand why it's correct. The software becomes a kind of a guide. It helps navigate the design. It catches certain errors before they happen. It produces an acceptable output even when the understanding behind the decision is still developing. And what that creates, not in everyone, but in enough people to make it matter, is a gap. A gap between the output and understanding, between producing and mastering. And here's the thing about a gap. It's patient. It waits. doesn't show up when everything goes according to plan. It shows up when something unexpected happens, when a case behaves differently, when the design fails, when the material does something the software didn't anticipate, when the complication arrives that the workflow wasn't built to handle. And suddenly, that question gets asked, out loud or internally, do I actually understand the system well enough to solve this problem? Or I was just following the path from left to right? When I look at technicians entering the trade today, I don't think they're fundamentally different than when I started. Of course, the environment's different, the tools are different, the workflows have changed dramatically. But the human part of the equation is remarkably familiar. When I was young and in the lab, my primary focus was simple. How do I get this case finished? How do I make it fit? How do I get it out the door on time? Those are practical questions, and every technician asks them because the lab environment forces you to think that way. Cases are waiting, the schedules are moving, someone needs something, and they need it by Friday. You learn very quickly that productivity matters. And I'm not criticizing that. That instinct is part of surviving in this trade. It's part of how you build discipline. But the technician who eventually becomes the strongest voice in the room, the ones people defer to, the ones whose opinions can change the direction of treatment plans, they start asking different types of questions somewhere along the way. They start asking, why? Why does this design succeed in some cases and fail in others? Why does this material behave differently at different thicknesses? Why did that framework distort in the furnace? Why did this restoration fracture even though the design looked right? Those questions, man, they slow you down. They pull you off production. And into those continuing education classes, into conversations with other technicians who've seen things you haven't seen yet. And over time, they build something that somehow never builds on its own. Depth. I remember when I was first going to those CE courses, back in the garage years, when the Velcro wallet was nearly empty, but somehow I was spending money on classes anyway. Because something in me understood it was the only way I could develop a path to becoming that person. I loved being in those rooms, not just for the content, but for the feeling of watching passionate people do the things that they loved. They weren't just showing you how to lay down the opaque, they were explaining what the opaque was actually doing, why the thickness mattered, why contamination at that stage could compromise everything that followed. Why the sequence was the sequence. And every time I walked out of those rooms and went back to the bench, I went back differently. Not just with a new skill, but maybe with a new set of questions. That's what the why does. It multiplies. Because when you understand why something works, you can start to see when conditions are changing. You can anticipate the failure before it arrives. You can adjust in real time instead of reacting after the fact. That's the shift. That's the transition from following a workflow to actually shaping one. And I think it's the most important transition that any technician can make. Again, I want to tread carefully here, but I'm going to say it anyways because I think it needs to be said. And I'd rather it come from someone who sat on both sides of this. You see, I have a social media presence. I post cases. I share opinions. I show up in this trade in ways that are visible. So I'm not throwing stones from a glass house. I'm fully aware of what I'm about ready to describe because I participate in it. And honestly, I'm aware of the full irony of making this argument on a podcast. But over the past decade, something has quietly shifted in how authority is perceived in dentistry. And I think it deserves an honest look. Social media has done genuinely remarkable things for this profession. Knowledge travels faster. A technician in a small lab in the Midwest can see what a world class clinician and technician are doing on the other side of this planet. Innovation spreads. Younger professionals have access to information that my generation had to track down through years of mentorship and conferences and an expensive continuing education. The connection this trade has now compared to what we had 20 years ago is extraordinary. But visibility and wisdom are not the same thing. And when they start getting confused, something important gets lost. I've sat in lectures from people that I've genuinely respected, people doing great work in areas I'm deeply familiar with. And there's been moments when I'm sitting there in this lecture and I realize something. That concept being presented is theoretically correct. The slides are just gorgeous and beautiful. The explanation that they're sharing makes sense, but sitting there with the experience I have, I can see the real-world execution will never look that way. Not the way they're just describing it, not because the person is being dishonest, but because there's a gap between when something looks this perfect under ideal conditions and what it demands of you when you're running it every day under the real-world variables. That gap is not going to show up on that slide. That beautiful case photo is not going to reveal the troubles that you might have because it's going to show up on a Tuesday afternoon when it doesn't behave the same way the course said it would. A single successful case doesn't reveal the dozens of variables that may have surrounded it. It doesn't reveal the years of repetition that may have preceded it. It doesn't reveal the complications that may have been quietly managed along the way. But somehow, the human mind naturally associates visibility with expertise. If someone appears often enough and speaks confidently enough, the audience somehow assigns authority to that. And guys, that's not always wrong. I think there's a lot of people that are visible in this trade that earn that visibility. They've put in the reps. They got the depth behind the polish. But not always. And when that recognition arrives faster than the wisdom, something gets compromised. Not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, through accumulated shortcuts, through a generation of technicians who've learned the workflow before they've learned the system behind it. Through courses that show you how, without spending nearly enough time on why. I want to say something honest before I go further. I've stood in rooms and taught things that I understood so well. I've also stood in rooms where I've taught things where I was still learning. I know the difference between those two experiences from the inside. And guys, that second one, the one where you're half a step ahead of where your own understanding is, that's exactly what I'm describing. I've been there. Which is why I know what the costs the people in those seats. I want to be clear about something. This is not an attack on enthusiasm. This trade needs enthusiasm. It needs people who are excited about the new techniques, the new materials, the new ways of doing things. That energy is how this profession evolves. But, guys, enthusiasm is not expertise, and when they look the same from the outside, when the presentation is polished enough and the photos are good enough, well, it's kind of really hard to tell the difference. Guys, that's when the audience is at risk. Because behind every compelling slide deck, there's a patient. And guys, that patient deserves someone who's been tested by the system, not just someone who's been seen on it. I got a call not so long ago from a clinician that was in the middle of a case. This GP had referred it out to a surgeon. They placed the implants, and now it was his job to restore the case. And he called me in a way that a lot of clinicians call me, not with a question exactly, but maybe more like he was thinking out loud. He walked me through the situation. He told me about the implant positions, what the patient's existing occlusion was, and the timeline that they were working with. And then he just reached out and said, "What should we do?" That's a really important question. And I'm sitting there and I've got that question hundreds of times over the years, but there was something in the way that he said it that told me the path hadn't clearly been defined yet. So I asked him something very simply. I said, "What does the patient expect?" And then I got that uncomfortable pause, that just a little bit of silence. And he finally says, "I didn't ask." And I said it, and I said this not in a cruel way, but I said, "Well, then we're already behind." Not because he had done anything wrong technically, not because the implant positions were wrong, but because without understanding the destination, you can't map the road. And in complex implant restorations, the road matters as much as the destination. This is what experience eventually teaches you. The most important part of the case often happens before a single tool touches the bench. It happens in the conversation, in the questions that get asked, in the expectations get defined or not defined. Because expectations are everything in this trade. A technically perfect restoration that doesn't match what the patient imagined is not a success. It may be excellent dentistry, but if the patient expected something different and nobody stopped to find out what, well, you built the wrong thing beautifully. Over the years, I've developed what I think of as a if this, then that mindset. When I'm working with clinicians on complex cases, you see, it's not a script. It's more like a reflex. If the implants are in this position, it creates this situation. Then we adjust the design this way. If the material has a limitation, well, then we address it before we commit to it. If the risk is present, we name it before it names itself loudly and at the delivery appointment in front of the patient. This process isn't about overwhelming anyone. It's about preparation. Because when you anticipate challenges ahead of time, they stop becoming disasters. They become those anticipated variables. And anticipated variables have solutions. But, those surprises don't. That mindset comes from repetition, from having seen enough cases go sideways to understand where the system has weak points, from refusing to assume that case will follow the script just because the last one happened to. It also comes from something that sounds almost counterintuitive. It's what I call planning for failure. I know that sounds strange, but the best work I've done in my career has come from asking these things before I start. What's most likely going to go wrong here? And how do I design around that? Materials fatigue. The forces accumulate. Biology is not always predictable. The mouth is not a controlled environment, no matter how precise the workflow was when the restoration left the lab. And guys, if you understand where the weak points live, well, you design them with that in mind. You build in the protection before the system actually needs it. And the patients who benefit most from that kind of thinking, well, guys, I'm never going to know that happened. They'll just have a restoration that actually lasts. I say that's the invisible work. That's the kind nobody photographs. And it's the kind that only comes from experience deep enough to know what can go wrong. In episode 1, I said something that I've come back to more times than I can count. Mastery of anything in this life isn't sexy. It's just repetition disguised as insight. I still believe that, but maybe I'll add something to it today. Because repetition alone doesn't get you there. And in a trade that's moving as fast as ours is right now, that distinction matters more than it ever has. The reps matter. I can't overstate that. You certainly cannot build judgment without doing the work. You can't develop a real feel for any material without handling it hundreds of times under varying conditions. You cannot build the type of clinical confidence that makes a doctor call you before they cut a tooth without being in those situations long enough to see how the system really behaves. Those reps are not optional. But here's the real wisdom in it all. Repetition without reflection doesn't build wisdom. It just reinforces habits. And if those habits have flaws in them, maybe flaws you haven't stopped long enough to examine, well, repetition will make those flaws stronger, not weaker. Guys, you can repeat the wrong thing 500 times and get very good at producing the same wrong outcome. Faster, more confidently, with better technique, but still wrong. I had a stretch early in my career where we were grinding out denture work at pace. Pace we were proud of, moving the cases, staying on top of the schedule, keeping clients happy. What I didn't realize until later, some of what I was repeating was imprecise. It certainly wasn't catastrophically wrong, it just wasn't right. Not functioning the way it should over time, not lasting the way it should. And because I hadn't slowed down to ask why cases occasionally came back or why certain clients were a little more frustrated than others, I was building that imprecision into my hands. I was getting better at something that needed to be different, not more efficient. It was maybe the continuing education that really broke that pattern for me. Sitting in classrooms and having someone who had seen more than me show me what I was missing. And it wasn't just the technique, guys. It was actually the reasoning behind the technique. The why. That's when the reps started building something useful instead of just building speed. There's a version of this happening at scale right now in this trade. Workflows are being repeated, maybe without the underlying system being understood. Cases are moving through labs and practices that look right on delivery but carry variables that won't reveal themselves for months or maybe years. And because the pace of modern dentistry doesn't always encourage the follow-up, the reflection, that honest post-delivery conversation about what actually happened, those lessons don't always get learned. The work leaves, another case comes in, the cycle continues. I'm not describing bad people or lazy technicians. I'm describing the natural consequences of a system that rewards speed and penalizes slowing down. But guys, dentistry has a way of collecting on those debts eventually. And when it does, the technician or clinician who built their practice or on repetition without reflection is suddenly standing in front of a complication they don't fully understand and certainly don't have the foundation to navigate. That's the cost. That's the cost of skipping the reflection. And it's the cost that will always come due. There comes a point in a long career where people start asking you to share what you know. It starts small, maybe a colleague with a question, a newer technician will be looking over your shoulder, clinician asking you how you approach something that maybe they've never seen before. And then one day, someone asks you, hey, would you be willing to stand in front of a room and talk about it? Guys, that's when everything changes. Because at that moment, the teaching stops just being a simple conversation and becomes something with reach. What you say in that room doesn't stay there. It travels. Technicians go back to their benches and apply it. Clinicians, they go back to their practices and implement it. And eventually, those ideas find their way into the work that ends up in real patients. That reality gives education a weight that maybe not everyone takes seriously enough. I've been lecturing for years. I want to be honest with you about what that responsibility feels like, because I think it gets glossed over in a trade that's started to treat this conference circuit as part of a brand building process. When I stand in front of the room, I'm not performing. I'm not building a platform. I'm trying sincerely to hand people a tool. And the quality of that tool and how well it works in the real world under real world conditions with real complications, well, that depends entirely on how deeply I actually understand what I'm handing them. If I teach something that I've done successfully twice, I haven't taught the failure mode. I haven't taught what happens when the case doesn't follow the script. I haven't taught the part that only shows up in rep 200, 300, 500. And that person sitting in the audience doesn't know what they're missing. They walk away with a technique and none of that scar tissue. That's not teaching, that's a demonstration. And demonstration has value, don't misread me. But it's not the same as education. Education is what happens when you share not just the success, but the failure. Not just what to do, but what to watch for. Not just the path, but the places where the path disappears. The most valuable educators I've encountered in my career were not the most polished. They were the most honest. They talked about cases that went sideways. They shared the moments where the system actually surprised them. They demonstrated curiosity right alongside competence because they understood that this trade will always be larger than any one person's experience. That honesty built something that perfect demonstrations never can. Trust. Because when an audience recognizes what they're hearing has been tested, really tested, through the repetition and the failure and the reflection of it all, they receive it differently. They carry it differently. And they apply it with the most appropriate weight. And here's what I want you to leave with today. This episode isn't about discouraging anyone from sharing what they know. It's the opposite, actually. This trade gets better when knowledge is circulating, right? A rising tide lifts all ships. Somebody quite wise shared that with me. But the tide rises on the back of honest knowledge that's been earned through the reps you couldn't skip, knowledge that's been tested by failure and refined by reflection, knowledge that's been around long enough to know what it doesn't know. If you're early in your career and you're sitting here thinking this sounds like gatekeeping, I hear you. But I want to say directly, it's not. It's an invitation. Lean into the why. Don't settle for understanding how a workflow produces an outcome. Find out why it produces that outcome. Study the material. Study the biomechanics. Sit in rooms with people who's been doing it longer than you and ask those uncomfortable questions. Let the reps teach you. And then let that reflection turn those reps into something lasting. Because the authority you build that way, the kind that comes from someone calling you before they cut a tooth, not because your follower count, but because they trust your judgment. That's the kind that doesn't fade when the algorithm changes. The thing about teaching that I keep coming back to, the moment that you stand in front of that room, you're making a promise to everyone in it. You're telling them, without saying it out loud, I've been far enough into this to show you the way. I've not just seen the good outcomes, I've seen when it breaks. I've felt the weight of getting it wrong. And I've done the work to understand why. That promise is not something you can fake for long. The questions will find the gap. A real case will find the gap. And when it does, the people you taught are standing at their benches in front of their patients with your incomplete map. That's the moral weight of teaching in this trade. That's why it matters who stands in front of the room. Not because of the age or the pedigree or how many years someone spent in the garage with that turkey cooker, but because of honesty. Because of whether you've done the reps that allow you to keep the promise. You can learn a workflow in a weekend. You earn authority through repetition, through reflection, through the willingness to examine the problem long after everyone else has moved on. Because in the end, experience isn't the number of years that you've been in the trade. It's the number of problems you refuse to ignore. The reps don't lie. They never have. Protect your margins. Protect your meaning. Thank you. Oh, hey, I'm glad I caught you before you clicked off. I'm going to ask a favor of you guys. The show is growing, which I'm very proud of. If you guys are seeing any value in the show, if you are enjoying the time and effort that I'm putting into this, there's one simple thing that many of you have not done that is free. Just go hit that follow button. That follow button does two great things. One, immediately you're going to be notified of a new show, which is awesome. But secondly, what you can do to help our trade and the visibility of this show is stimulate that silly algorithm that will give us an opportunity to push this information out to more deserved ears. So if you're getting value out of this show, that's a simple thing that you can do for me. Do for me today. Interact with the show in any way. A like on each episode is awesome. Hitting those three little dots up in the upper right corner on Apple and clicking follow me, that's a super powerful way that we can get this message out to the masses. Thanks so much, guys. I'm going to thank you for your consideration on doing that. And until next time, it's been John Wilson for Margins and Meaning.